Here's something most gardeners never think about. Two people can grow the same size garden, work just as hard, and spend the same amount of time. But one of them will grow 3 times as much food, 3 times as many calories. Not because they're better gardening, and not because they have better soil, but because they chose to grow different crops. And that's the one decision that makes all the difference. Today, I want to show you what we grow here at Possum Ridge Farms and why the crops you choose matter so much more than how pretty your garden looks. And frankly, that's a lesson that took us a while to learn. When we first started gardening, we grew what everybody grew: tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, that sort of thing. And we felt productive. And the baskets looked good. The meals tasted good. But when we stepped back and looked at everything we'd grown throughout the entire season, it didn't amount to a hill of beans. At least not enough food to sustain us for a whole year. That's when we realized we had to change how we planned our garden. Over time, we had to change how we think about gardening. Instead of asking, what do we feel like growing this year? We started asking, what will produce the most food in the least amount of space with the least amount of risk? Because if your goal is to feed your family, production has to come first, not preference. Look, we prioritize crops that do at least one of 3 things. They produce a large amount of food. They store well in the long term, or they keep producing for a very long season. Potatoes are the big one for us. They're one of the most efficient calorie crops you can grow. They're filling, dependable, and store well without refrigeration. You can harvest a surprising amount of food in a single row. Here at the farm, we grow Yukon Gold, Kennebec, and Butterball. Beans are another, especially varieties that produce heavily in small spaces. They're dependable, they give you steady harvests, and they preserve well. We usually can ours, which allows us to store a lot of food without utilizing any freezer space. And beans aren't just volume, they give you protein. They turn side dishes into real meals sitting on the shelf. Here at the farm, we grow top crop and Blue Lake, bush. We generally do not grow pole beans here. Sweet potatoes are another staple here at the farm. They handle heat, they produce heavily, and store for months. They're another dependable staple crop. We also grow a lot of pumpkins and winter squash. But remember, they do take some room. Varieties like Cherokee Tan and Seminole pumpkins can spread all over the place. But they produce a lot of food and keep forever after the harvest, which for us at least makes the space worthwhile. If space is tighter where you are, there are smaller varieties that you can still get good production without taking over your whole garden. And then there are crops that keep producing over time. Certain greens, for instance, turnips and peppers, will give you steady harvest without constant replanting. We grow greens all winter long here. That means fresh food coming out of the garden even when most gardeners are shut down for the season. They're not staple calories by themselves, but they stretch the food supply and keep production going year-round. Now, with all this said, that doesn't mean we never grow tomatoes, cucumbers, and all the other garden favorites. We still grow them, but we don't rely on them because a lot of popular garden crops are what I call snack crops. They're great fresh, they're enjoyable to grow. You can even can a few or freeze a few, but they just don't carry you very far. They don't produce enough calories or store well enough to truly feed a family. So we give them less space, not because they're bad, but because they're not high return crops. When we first started shifting toward production crops, the garden didn't suddenly look better. If anything, it looked simpler, more rows, fewer varieties, less color. But it started producing more food that actually mattered. More food that could be stored. More food that could stretch through the winter. And more food that filled us up instead of just adding something fresh to a meal. That's when we realized we weren't just gardening anymore, we were building a food system. Everyone grows differently depending on their goals. I'm kind of curious on what you grow mostly in your garden. Are you growing more for fresh meals, maybe a snack, or are you trying to grow food that lasts and really feeds your family in the long term? If you would, let me know in the comments. By the way, I do read every one. Look, a small garden growing the right crops can outproduce a large garden growing the wrong ones. That's something a lot of people just don't realize. They think they need more land, more raised beds, more equipment, more stuff. But often, the biggest difference comes from a better crop strategy. Once you start thinking like a producer instead of a hobbyist, your entire garden layout starts to change. If you're planning your next garden, simply try this. Dedicate part of the space to high return crops first. The foods that store well, the foods that fill you up, and the foods that keep producing. Then, with whatever space is left, grow the extras, the fresh snacks, the favorites. That small shift alone can dramatically change how much food your garden really provides. You don't need to grow everything. You just need to grow what matters. And once you make that shift, your garden starts working for you instead of just keeping you busy. From all of us here at Possum Ridge Farms, until next time, I'll see you down at the barn.